to this planet, a planet known as Earth, but more appropriately a water planet with some 70% of its surface covered by ocean, not then to count the Great Lakes or the rivers. Indeed, a planet which, for its vast aquatic resources, is a planet which has relied upon that water, not only as a means of sustenance, not only as the means by which we came to the land from the sea, but also a place where we as a species have used that water to connect with each other for a variety of purposes, largely trade, commerce, recreation, war, all have drawn us to those waters. And yet for all of that, and throughout our entire span of history on this planet, we have understood very little, perhaps the surface of the oceans by themselves, but not what lies beneath. And indeed, down there resides what is most likely the greatest museum of all on this planet, with apologies. The Great Museum of the Sea, where collectively, on the bottom, from every aspect of our history, from drowned campfires and ancient pathways as people spread on the maritime routes across and around the world, but also to the various ages of seafaring and with the ships that have gone and those that have been lost. Some 3 million of them, perhaps, as estimated by UNESCO, now lie beneath it. But finding and understanding this history, appreciating it, dealing with it, has been a matter of, at first, conjecture, if not fear. And ultimately, as technology developed and evolved, we began to explore down there, to see what lay beneath. Initially, of course, at first, the idea was that anything that lay beneath the surface of the ocean was of value. And indeed, that argument, that idea, that firm commitment on the part of some remains to this day, that everything that lies beneath the bottom of the sea is a commodity. And so, in the early years, long before nautical archaeology sprang forth from the head of George Bass in the basement of his museum in 1960, long before then, as hard hat divers and diving bell explorers descended to the bottom, the idea was to find wrecks, to salvage what they could from them, and in doing so encounter strange and wonderful things. But in the finding of them, this was always the big issue: how to find something in an otherwise untracked, unmarked sea. Bear in mind, it's not until the end of the 18th century that we even come up with it. The idea that has then been the practice of measuring longitude and latitude, both correctly to draw X marks the spot. But even then, how do you do that other than standing on the deck of the sextant, gazing up, and then fixing a position from which now you're going to descend to the bottom? Well, what does one do? One drags an anchor, they ask people, or in the case of the modern wrecks, they look for the oil well or not. In this fashion, things were found, but in the shallower waters, certainly not in the deeper waters. And so it would come to pass ultimately that, in time, deeper shipwrecks and deeper elements of our heritage would be discovered. But, coming back and, of course, a little more seriously, it was indeed in 1959 and leading into 1960 here at this museum that the discovery of a Turkish sponge dome of rare and strange copper ingots inspired a visit by journalist and adventurer Peter Throckmorton to that site, and then ultimately here to Philadelphia, and after attending a meeting with the Archaeological Institute of America, to come to the basement to meet Flo Rainey and talk about this site and the need to have an archaeologist go dig it up. This was a somewhat radical idea. Jacques Cousteau, of course, was finding shipwrecks and knew that divers could do this, and archaeologists, cadets, they don't even know how to dive. But that gauntlet having been thrown down, and with a young, willing archaeologist ready to take that course and learn how to dive at the YMCA and go off to Turkey and commence what would become the first full scientific excavation of a shipwreck from the sea. The science, the practice, the discipline, the art of nautical archaeology began. And in those early years, from the site of Delgado to the later site of Uluburun, with the oldest shipwrecks then found, we began to gain an appreciation of what the sea had to offer. Not just statues mended by fishermen's nets, not just commodities, not just coins spilled on a beach from a wrecked Spanish galleon, but rather the stuff of which archaeology is made civilizations, reconstructing trade routes, rewriting the history books, and understanding that in the technique lay the answer to resolving a number of questions as well as posing numerous. So if you look at the excavation under the lagoon and you see in its extreme depth of 108 feet in that day, the thought of 11 years of excavation through all those field seasons of meticulously hand mapping, plotting and drawing everything in, from the wicker that once formed the sides of a basket-built boat that Homer would once upon a time have sung of, to a scatter of goods that represented a trade cargo from 12 separate cultures in the ancient Mediterranean, to a diptych preserved in a pitloy, rare form of an ancient book. All of this rendered carefully, meticulously, with the limits of scuba diving and drawing on mylar and stretching tapes underwater, come up with something that you see here in this drawing of the lagoon wreck. Just pause for a moment now in the digital age and consider that that was done by hand at every stage and at every step. With, you all know Jamal, what the archaeologist who worked with George Bass on this, you understand that he also not measure once or twice as a carpenter does, 4 times. At 180 feet, breathing air, which, for those of you who don't dive, understand that every 30 feet, we archaeologists, and all of us divers actually have something we call the Martini rule. Martini's law basically means every 30 feet it's the equivalent of taking a stiff one. So 6 martinis down, we measure times. What they did was magic. What they did is show us for the very first time that archaeology wasn't just possible, that it was practical, that it could be done, that we could learn a great deal. And from this, nautical archaeology began to spread around not only the Mediterranean, but elsewhere around the world. And to this time now, as a result of that first excavation at Delgado and the subsequent work done there by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and so many others, a variety of shipwrecks have added immeasurably to our understanding of the past. But the idea of going deep, finding things well beyond the range of divers, finding, let alone working, seemed impossible until 1985, when Robert Ballard and John Louis Michel discovered the Titanic. That wreck, 2.5 miles down in the abyssal plains of the North Atlantic, resting on the edge of a canyon in 12,453 feet of water with 6,000 pounds per square inch pressure, squeezing you in utter darkness and freezing cold temperatures. The discovery of that vessel excited people for a variety of reasons. It excited people because the lost, seemingly undiscovered, could be found. It excited people because here was a ship that had tugged and pulled at the consciousness of the Western world since it had sunk close to a century earlier. It tugged at people because here was the idea that if you methodically and carefully search with the right technology and with the right amount of time, and basically what that meant was the right amount of money, you could find things. And ultimately, what also tugged at people was the realization that this wreck in particular ignited an entire body of controversy over what should be done with it. As a more or less modern wreck, was it archaeological? Was it historical? Was it a grave? Was it a memorial? Or was it something to be commodified in that age-old, timeless human pursuit of gaining riches from the deep? Well, Titanic ultimately came to be all of that. And indeed, the controversy that swirled around Titanic continued to this day. But, simply stated, going back to what a number of us felt at the time in 1985, was the understanding that one day archaeology would reach into the deepest depths of the vital frontier. So, let's fast forward. Today, as a result of new technology, as a result of different interests, be they government or not, the oceans are systematically being probed and mapped. A few years ago, it was observed that of the 70% of the planet, we only knew about 5% of it. That's right, 95% of the oceans are unknown. I'm talking about the surface, I'm talking about everything in between, particularly the seabed. But thanks to technologies, we have been able to do more. Part of the revolution, if you will, is as simple as GPS. Because with that, we can now pretty much, with accuracy, unless you're driving my car, understand where you are at any given moment. No, I'm not going to turn left now. Basically, it's muttered a lot in the car. Or really? Really? 150 feet away? I'm here. But all kidding aside, GPS could revolutionize what we do in the high seas. Particularly if you're in government ship and it's not scrambled. What also has happened is that the same satellite technology at work has enabled us now to reach out beyond the confines of a ship and a mere expeditionary crew that's there locked into that vessel to reach a wider audience, both of other scholars in terms of cloud computing and working together, but also in terms of reaching the public and sharing what is going on. And in this way, whether you are a government ship like Nova Ship of Exploration, the Okeanos Explorer, which belongs to all of you, or Odyssey Explorer, which belongs to a commercial company which seeks shipwrecks for commercial gain, this technology is more or less universally available to all. China just recently announced they're spending $55 million to build their own oceanographic archaeological research to work on the high seas. Others, of course, are doing the same. Dr. Robert Ballard, of course, operates Nautilus with his Ocean Exploration Trust, which also does this. So you have a ship, you have satellites, you have GPS, but what you also have is technology which has increasingly gotten sharper and better, in every sense of the word, to survey the bottom of the sea. The gentleman you see there is Martin Klein from MIT, and his adaptation of sonar, working with Harold Edgerton and others, revolutionized the field of underwater survey, in particular the discovery of shipwrecks, through his initial side scan sonar, whereby flying this fish off the end of a tow line in the back of a vessel, you could systematically paint the bottom of the ocean with sound. It didn't matter how dark the water was. You were looking at sound. And you would come back with the echo of anything that rose above the sea that had bounced off of that object and come back to the transducer on the side of the sonar head. And so it was that things like barges, aircraft, a famous bomber found at the bottom of Loch Ness, but no monster, shipwrecks, all began to be revealed. What has happened in the years since is that side-scan sonar has developed dramatically now to higher resolution instrumentation, which enables us not only to pick up things like the tail of a downed aircraft, now practically to the rivets, but also shipwrecks. The dark stripe in the middle, by the way, is where the sonar head would pass. But also, now we're able to manipulate side-scan sonar and get near 3D imaging out of it with sharper, crisper detail. So sonar, particularly side-scan sonar, has come a long way in just the last few decades. But there is also hull-mounted systems, both side-scan, but also multi-beam sonar, which is what NOAA uses for our Office-to-Coast survey to map the seabeds to keep the highways of commerce open. Incidentally, along the way, they find shipwrecks and other things. And in this fashion, multi-beam sonar not only enables us to insonify, there's a word I didn't know until I joined, but insonify the seabed. And in doing so, get these magnificent three-dimensional maps. These three-dimensional maps, of course, do a great deal. Not only do they show you where a channel is dredged and where it's changed as a result of supersonic sanding, they also give you a sense of what a shoreline used to be. And now, not only in terms of mapping the continental shelf, are we learning more about the geology, but you can actually see relic shorelines from the time when the last glacial maximum had exposed areas where human beings obviously once lived and passed. But it also gives us the opportunity to do this type of insonification and come up with remarkable 3D imagery of shipwrecks on the bottom. Now that's not exactly sonar that's going to get you to the stage where you can map it to the same level of accuracy as Jamal Bullock and George Bass and the team did at Uluru. But there are now new sonar systems off the shelf, declassified, that do. And we've just started to deploy and use some of these, as well as new laser systems that also work underwater, that can map with accuracy far more than an Arctic diver can with 6 martinis in their system underneath, even though diving has evolved and we now use mixed gas, and you're not getting the same buzz as you will by diving on air. The other thing that's happened is that we've developed technology that both is tethered and untethered, that enables us not only to survey and map, but also to do a variety of work where divers can go. This is a slide of 2 systems that were recently used on mapping the Titanic site. And they are pretty much industry standard now for any type of survey. The REMUS 6000, you see, there's an autonomous underwater vehicle, or an AUV. It's essentially an underwater drone. In size, it would basically fit on this stage. It goes for 20 hours on a charge. It's got great lithium batteries. It has sonar, both multi-beam and side scan when you hook it up that way. In this case, we just use side scan. It can tell you where it is. Has collision avoidance laser, so if it's coming up and you see something, you can move out of the way. You can program it to do its dive, and it will collect all sorts of data for you if you put the other sensors into it. It is a brilliant sensor probe, if you will, that can go down there, and systematically we use these now to survey vast areas of the seabed. REMUS 6000 was used to map Titanic. It was used to find the Air France disaster, and recently these REMUSs were also used in the, for now, unsuccessful bid to find MH370. The best part of these is that, of course, they store all of that data. They come to the surface, and you either collect them, or unlike, how many of you are parents of teenagers were? Unlike that kid, this will phone when it comes to the surface and you're not there. So, a remarkable bit of technology that can cover a vast area around the world. We're currently working on a proposal to map an area and to do a detailed map of the entire area of seabed, 240 square miles, and the team said, yeah, we can get that done for you down to Topeka, Boston, a week. So I think that that 5% is going to start to grow. Also there, you see the Remora 6000. The 6000, by the way, is its depth capacity in meters. So you're looking at close to 20,000 feet for both of these. So that's not the deepest part of the ocean, but it covers most of the oceans. So with the Remora, what you're able to do is that's basically a world-class robot that can hover at the end of a fiber optic cable miles down and do whatever you want it to do. It can take pictures, it can insonify at a high level, it can retrieve artifacts, it can do samples, you name it. It's whatever you can map on the system. To give you a sense of how this all works, let's just talk quickly about mapping the Titanic. The color that you see there is the multi-beam survey done by NOAA of the area in the Atlantic in which the Titanic rests. And that's about 240 square miles. This is the area in which the wreck of Titanic exists, and this was done with the REMUSs, two of them working in tandem over 3 days. Zooming in, you actually have the Titanic wreck itself. Bow, stern, and a scatter of material from the disintegration of the middle portion of the hull the Titanic collects to broke. And when you get closer with the side scan, here's the stern of the Titanic. Again, tip of the stern, peeled away hull section, the aperture where the funnel was, and the engines just starting to stick out, plus scattered structure, hull, and machinery from the wreck. What you then do, working with the Remora, and what was done in this case, was three-dimensional imagery and stitching that imagery on top of the three-dimensional sonar. So while you're looking at this flat on the screen, in certain computer programs, you can actually look at this and walk between the pieces 3D, except for the gaps. We didn't cover everything. So the gray is areas where the REMUS didn't, when the REMUS went, and that's all sound. The color is where the Remora went, and that's imagery that's stitched over. So what you have here is the area around the stern of Titanic. You have buoys. You have a section of the hull peeled away with a reciprocating pump. You have the stern itself. There's the aperture for the funnel. There's the engine sticking out of the engine room, cranes, the lift, the motors for the lift of the elevator. Section of hull here. Base of a crane there. And it's not just a picture, it's mapped to the same level of accuracy that Boulevard was when you get it to its highest resolution. Likewise, the same thing done with the sections of the hull. Again, all of this systematically done with the Remora and basically pulling all this together. One of the secrets of the trade, by the way, is, of course, is a tremendous amount of post-processing that happens in the laboratories. In this case, the Advanced Imaging and Visualization Lab at Woods Hole. But all 3D, including profile views of Titanic for the very first time, and just to give you a sense of resolution. This is a lower res, but when you're working on this, and in particular when we're doing the map we can fly with better accuracy than we could with a two-dimensional screen. We were able to zoom in and capture a fair amount of detail, and then use the measuring lasers as well to back up what the sonification was telling us. So constantly collecting sonar and visual imagery as well as just physical imagery. Robots also, not on our mission, but elsewhere, say particularly with James Cameron, have been able to go into Titanic in areas where divers could not go, not even counting that it's 6,000 psi and no human could live down there. But the fact that you could send these tiny robots in and visit areas, that's the suite of Isidore and Ida Strauss, with the clocks along the mantelpiece, and that's the Turkish bath, like the steam area inside Titanic, well inside. So, technology literally can take you anywhere if you've got the time and the money. In the case of Titanic, a fair amount of time and money has been spent going to recover some 5,000 artifacts, putting them on display, at one stage potentially seeing them sold, though that did not happen. And therein lies a fair amount of controversy, because while some have the motivation to go and to find, to study, to protect and preserve, others have other needs, other wishes, other desires. And in that, of course, inevitably conflict arises when different values meet, not only on the high seas, but anywhere, with people arguing over what the appropriate thing is to do, particularly something like Titanic. Even archaeological exploration, the work that Jim Cameron does going inside the wreck, has been controversial for some who argue that it's a tomb and should remain ever inviolate. And yet we know that through archaeology and through the work in tombs, we learn a great deal. And in this very museum, seeing the results of the excavation of the Royal Burial Ground of Ur, we learn a tremendous amount that's being demonstrated even now in the laboratory open to the public to see this skeleton being examined. I think the line gets much firmer and much, well, a line really shouldn't be crossed when one begins to talk about selling the past to pay for it, or to just make money and to line somebody's pocket. And in this way, of course, that has become a big problem for the archaeological community. Decrying commercial recovery from shipwrecks, seeing the past turn into a commodity, seeing where a community would rally behind not seeing an Anasazi site, or a Etruscan tomb, or a Mayan site be mined for that which could be sold, and yet people just looking the other way, particularly in the past of the shipwrecks. This conflict, this tension still exists, and arguably, it's, for the most part, an argument that the commercial folks, for the most part, ignore. And many of them do their work on the high seas without talking about it, not sharing much about it, except for the occasional few. And then, as we know, there have been some rather fascinating cases that involved over that, which we'll talk about. In terms of Titanic, the reason the government was involved in mapping that wreck, by the way, was to understand it, to better map it, and to protect it. And as a result of that, we've been able to create the very first marine protected area on the high seas in international waters with Titanic just this past 2 years. It's a voluntary MPA. It doesn't carry the force of anything other than consensus, but it is a step in the right direction. That and other legal maneuvers have helped to protect the site of Titanic better. I'll close with one other site that offers a sense of not only technology, but of the issues, and that is 3 shipwreck sites which were discovered in 2011 by Shell Oil in the midst of doing survey of Galveston, 170 miles offshore, to do an oil and gas lease. In that area, because they're required to do so under U.S. law, because the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which administers this program, can't, as a federal agency, just simply sign off on something that's going to be injurious to the environment or agricultural resource. So these companies do these surveys, they bring professional companies in, they survey, they find things, they report it to BOEM. BOEM received a report of 3 small side-scan anomalies that look like shipwrecks. In 2012, that led to an that was done using Okeanos Explorer, Noah's ship. And as the cameras dropped down, again with only a couple of scientists on the ship, but with a vast community of the rest of us out there thanks to telepresence linked by satellite, we were all amazed at about 10 o'clock at night when we got the call from the ship saying, you need to turn on your screens now. And what emerged from this one target that they were diving was the copper-clad lower form of a ship, which as we investigated over the course of that evening, turned out to be a very significant vessel. Significant not only in the fact that it was the copper-clad ghost of a ship, but that it was an old ship, probably dating to the turn of the 19th century, a time in which the Gulf of Mexico was rapidly evolving from a colonial sea controlled largely by Spain, ostensibly by France, but challenged by Britain, into a contested waterway as empires fell, as new nations were born, as the War of 1812 raged, and in the aftermath of that, various pirates and privateers wandered those seas, plundering all ships in the name of either independent Mexico, independent Colombia, independent Argentina, or just for the fee purpose, or ultimately the Republic of Texas. So here we had a ship that, as we looked at it, not only seemed to date from that time period, but was an incredible time capsule with a variety of things, not only on the bottom, but lying roughly in the positions where they fell as a result of the inevitable decay and consumption of the wooden hull by marine organisms. And what an array of materials, not only ceramics, but navigational instruments, weapons, bottles with contents still intact in them. Clearly an armed vessel of some importance, clearly a vessel that was linked to this period. As we looked at the artifacts, best guess was that it hadn't sunk any time past 1820. This ultimately propelled the project where, and here you have a split. There would be some who would say, particularly if they saw gold, here's our chance. Let's go, let's get it, let's recover those coins, and let's also market this stuff. Let's say this is an important wreck, maybe it's the first privateer ever found. Think of what we can get when we get that octave up, and we conserve it, and then we can sell it. Think of what we can get for those coins, particularly even if they're a little distressed, because you know, that has that shipwreck effect that adds to its value. Oh, the bottles and stuff, I forget that. Maybe we can sell some of those plates. Maybe we can market the history. But it's not the same as what ultimately happened, which was a very detailed 60-page research design asking a whole series of questions, the development of an approach methodologically that was a biopsy, not an excavation, and using technology to its best to do a test excavation and do sampling on this wreck, which lies in 4,300 feet of water. We couldn't dive it, we couldn't approach it the way Hulaburun was done, and so we had to rely on the technology and the skills of the team on board the Nautilus, Dr. Robert Ballard's ocean exploration trust vessel. There, using a variety of equipment available to us, basically a great rip-roaring ROV named Hercules, the remotely operated vehicle, not unlike the Remora, using a deep-sea elevator, which carefully raised artifacts that had been recovered, and also monitoring everything not only from the surface and the control band by a telepresence, but also we made the decision to do this in the open. So we applied for and got an antiquities permit because out there, as the government, we wanted to do it right. We wanted to demonstrate we were walking the walk, that this was research-driven, that this was done under a permit. We don't know who the owner of this wreck is. We still don't. But we operated on the premise that someday perhaps there might very well be an owner. It may be a sovereign entity, it may be a private entity, who knows? What we also decided to do was to be completely transparent. So we turned the cameras on, and for 24 hours, throughout the entire week when we were out there, the world watched. Over 400,000 people watched as we did this, the characterization, the sampling, and the test excavation. Occasionally, what people got to see is that we made mistakes in archaeology. When the robot went to pick up that octant, and he went and he moved towards the wrong drawer, as I said, careful, careful. He cleaning it up and conservation is always a good excuse or a good answer. But in this process, we learned a great deal. This is the team, by the way, that did the ROV work. There is the Hercules ROV, and that is the means by which this work was done. Yes, there's a robotic system. There's a towed sled behind it that actually takes pictures and also gathers data while we're working. But I also want to say this. Technology is only as good as people. And in this case, the team there, most of those Ph.D.s in robotics and engineering were integral parts of the team. So, again, like I said, we broadcasted live. There were 7 of us on, representing the partnership from 3 federal agencies, 2 parts of NOAA, actually, 2 states, 3 universities, 2 nonprofit organizations that were dedicated to marine education and science that raised the money privately for this. And now we went and shared it with the world. This is the initial photo mosaic of the wreck, Monterey Bay, as we call it, showing all its artifacts in place. There's a more detailed measured one as well. And we did this map every hour that we were down on the site, particularly as we started the work. This is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional sonar map using the latest type of high-res multibeam. And then the recovery itself. That's a bottle out of the ship's medicine chest full of ginger. And that is a demijohn, likely filled with spirits originally, that is being lowered into the elevator for recovery. This is now pretty standard in terms of doing deep water archaeology. There's only been a few of these excavations that have been done. Some have been done by Odyssey Marine and other commercial firms. The government has lately gotten into this. For the most part, we document, we largely leave things alone. In this case, we needed to do this limited recovery of 60 artifacts of diagnostic materials so that we could come away with a better understanding of the wreck. Ultimately, by that recovery and through this, we have learned a great deal. We know, as you will likely see pretty soon in some media, as well as the next Society of Historical Archaeology conference, that the wreck is most likely a privateer lost prior to 1820. We did recover a small group of coins, and the latest date is 1815. This is a time of active privateering, and the fact that we found 2 shipwrecks lying close by that appear to be its captured prizes. One a hiding tallow ship, perhaps, or carrying copal or rubber and hides. The other, a large empty vessel that either had a perishable cargo or was sailing in ballast, all seemingly headed for Galveston and lost at once in a violent storm. We've come to a period which is known romantically, that's documented by some historians, but remains in its own way a frontier for further research. But more importantly, too, what we've done is we have opened Pandora's box. We have learned how to do archaeology at depth. We can do it to the same degree of sophistication and accuracy that we can as scuba divers. We can find pretty much anything. But in that, certainly with the case of these wrecks, questions arise. Whose is it? Will there be pressures put upon it because it has been found? What if we had seen these wrecks and the flash of gold had been? What if we had seen these wrecks and there were visible human remains? What if we'd seen these wrecks and they were clearly the warship of another power? All sorts of questions come to mind. And so, in closing, to pave the way for my colleague, I'll leave you with these observations. Absolutely, that final frontier is going to tell us a great deal. I would posit that by the time 25 to 40 years have passed, the 95% unknown is probably going to be 95% unknown. People are actively out there looking for a variety of reasons. We're also going to see that that great museum is just that. Every aspect of our experience on this planet where we took to the water is going to be down there in some way, shape, or form. From the very oldest to the most recent. And mysteries unresolved will be answered, even those of more modern Here's nothing you can't find. Ultimately, they'll find MH370, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. And it's already cost the Australians $60 billion. And finally, as